The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less in fact than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearances it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary, in these paintings my incipient delirium, perhaps, had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. Thus begins The Oval Portrait, the short story from Edgar Allan Poe. Now, we're going to have a discussion for this short story, but where we're going to start is with a So What Happened recap of the story. Then we'll get into a little bit of literary criticism, and finally we will end up with some writer's corner talk, a little bit of writer stuff that we can take from this into our own crafts. Now, the Oval Portrait, what happens herein? Our speaker, wounded, is courted into a room to spend the night. There are pictures which occupy him for a while, but he decides to turn his attention, towards the books, or vice versa. It was difficult for me to really understand what was going on in that portion, whether he started with the books and went to the pictures, or started with the pictures and went to the books, because the pictures are mentioned first in the opening paragraph, but the books are mentioned first in the actual sort of rundown of our narrator's story. But when he decides to turn his attention towards whatever it is he decides to turn his attention towards, he adjusts the lighting, the candelabra, the glow from which exposes a portrait he had not previously noticed. It is the portrait of a rather lovely young woman. And that portrait has a caption with it as well. It tells the story of the young woman, beautiful young woman, who fell in love with a painter, but the painter was in love with his craft, and she was jealous. Still, she loved him, so she was biding her time until he would turn his attention toward her, and indeed, that time did come. Finally, he turned his love to her, meaning his painting. He decided to paint the very portrait that our narrator is looking at, decided to paint the portrait of his lovely young bride, and he spent hours toiling over this painting. And when he was done, he realized the woman, his wife, that he was painting was dead. He had painted a portrait of a corpse. So that is what is going on in the short story itself. But I think there's a lot. There are a lot of things that we can talk about in this short story, and I think the place to start is the place that we start with our narrator. Our narrator here sort of begs the question. Our narrator introduces himself as wounded and does not tell us how. Still, our narrator is able to pass the night in this room that is not particularly well equipped for, I don't know, medical procedures. He's able to stay there and survive the night, survive long enough, in fact, to end up telling us this story. Why is it important that he is wounded? Well, I'll get around to that a little bit in the writer's corner portion of this, but if we are being as generous as possible to Poe, it would seem that what we are doing is this story is a meeting. This work is a meeting of two stories with very similar morals. The moral being our time here is expiring. Our time is short. The young woman decides, well, I will wait my time, and eventually my husband will come to me. He is a painter. He is doing his thing. It's the person with whom I fell in love. After all, I fell in love with him as a painter, not as a street merchant, right? This is who he is. It's part of what he is. And that's the person with whom I fell in love. And by the time he turns his attention toward her, hopefully, right, I think part of the sort of beckoning of him painting her is that he would fall in love with her all over again, right? Staring at her for this long, as beautiful as she was, he would fall back in love with her. By the time he was done, she was dead. Your time is running out. That's part of the moral of the young woman's story. That is paired with our narrator, who is wounded, so wounded that he has to find some place to lay down for the night. His Pedro does not believe that he would survive the night without cover. Does not believe he would survive the night without some place to stay. He would not survive the night under the moonlight. So, both of these stories will mirror each other a little bit, especially as the concession that we're getting from our narrator is that he is mortally wounded. Not mortally wounded, obviously, but wounded enough that mortality has to be brought into question. And upon retreating into some place to stay, he immediately turns towards the art. He loves the paintings. He loves the books that are there. Well, the young woman's husband loved the art. So there is something to be said for the mirroring of those things. Now, the other sort of idea that I want to get into here is one near and dear to my heart. Well, the third one is too. The third one is what's highlighted on your screen now. But the second one, this is a battle between art and more or verisimilitude, a battle between art, the beauty of art, and the beauty of your wife. So, the beauty of art and the beauty of the real world. This is a battle between the real thing and the representation. The artist at the end of this does not have his real wife. He has the portrait that he painted. So, in some ways, this is a battle between beauty and truth. You know where this is going if you've been on the channel for some time. Emily Dickinson is undoubtedly, and this has been proven scientifically several times over, the most brilliant artist of all time, the greatest poet that ever lived. Emily Dickinson, that's true, has a poem called I Died for Beauty. I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb. When one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room, he questioned softly why I failed. For beauty, I replied, and I for truth. The two are one, we brethren are, he said. And so, as kinsmen met a night, we talked between the rooms until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names. This short story, The Oval Portrait, has most of the same themes. The only theme sort of missing from this short story that is present in Emily Dickinson, the greatest poet who ever lived, her poem there is the assumption of anonymity by being consumed with your art or beauty or truth. In the poem, the art, the beauty and the truth are the same thing. We brethren are, he said. I died for beauty. You died for truth. We brethren are, he said, meaning that those two ideas, truth and beauty, kind of the same thing. Okay, I can accept that. Far out. Where Emily Dickinson goes a little bit further is to say that we talked between these rooms, you dying for truth, me dying for beauty. We talked between these rooms until the moss had reached our lips, so that we could not talk anymore, and covered up our names. The names that we held in our mortal lives before we were consumed by truth and beauty. Being thus consumed by truth and beauty, the anonymity is all but assumed. The anonymity by the moss covering our names is backed up by the moss covering our lips. We don't have to talk anymore because we're the same thing. Here with Poe, Poe is stopping, I would say, one step short of that. But instead of just stopping, he's sidestepping it and taking a little bit further on his own, saying that dying. So the young lady did not die for the craft. Kind of, she died of the craft. The sort of tragedy of her death is that she died without her lover's love, his attention, his craft, but without his love. So Poe, getting to the very end of the argument, the same argument put forth by Emily Dickinson, instead of swerving in and saying, yeah, no, these things are the same thing and we don't even have to have identity anymore, sidesteps it and says that there is some tragedy to be had here. And the tragedy is in not living your life while you have it, as opposed to it being a good thing that you sort of burn up in this truth or beauty conundrum. Now, on the screen, the next thing I want to talk about. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art. She, a maiden of the rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. All light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and the other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. Relationships will ruin anything you're trying to do except for relationships. Now, I know, don't take your relationship advice from the curmudgeonly guy who talks into a microphone all day about literature. But relationships will ruin everything except your relationships. Look just at the assumptions here. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. All she had was her beauty and her smile. That's all she was bringing to the table. That's all she had, baby, yeah. She was pretty. Okay, cool, great. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. She fell for someone who she already knew was a painter, already knew he had a craft. And by the way, having a craft, being a painter, a little more impressive than having a really nice smile. He had worked towards something. And I don't think, look, I'm not making a gendered argument here. I think this goes both ways. Being a very pretty young maiden myself, I have been in these shoes. He was passionate, studious, and austere. Now, passionate, studious, and austere are being connected to the evil hour. Do you see the assumption inherent in this? That being passionate and studious and austere, well, shouldn't you just be pretty, Mr. Painter? Shouldn't you take things less seriously, Mr. Painter? You don't have to be good at anything, you can just be. You already have the love of the pretty young woman. Then we go towards, where is it here? He already had a bride in his art. Well, she knew that. She got in the relationship with him. She, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. We get it a second time here. All light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn. How delightful. How dreadfully boring. Loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which she knew he loved and knew he loved before he loved her, dreading only the palette and brushes and the other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. She wanted to see his face, but he was busy working. Aw, shucks. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. So you have a talented painter that you decided to marry when you knew he was a painter and he's good at what he does, and when he says he wants to paint you, you're upset. Now, I know I'm being a little bit negative, Nancy. I'm being maybe a bit superfluous, but honestly, do you know anyone in a relationship that's really accomplishing anything out of the ordinary? Or someone in a relationship that's happy? Maybe it's just the corner of the world that I'm in. I don't know. I can't say. I've never met those people. Just saying. Just putting it out there. Now let's move over to the writer's corner portion of this. Here's where I want to start with this. I have one overarching thing to talk about, and then I have one thing that is just sort of craft in the work, just some bad writing to point out. Why do we get this story filtered through our speaker who is so gravely injured? Why do we get this story there? Why don't we get firsthand the story of the painter and his wife? It would even begin with the way that Edgar Allan Poe loves to do. We could get a short story called The Painter and His Wife, and it would be firsthand and it would be immediate. It would not be passive in the way that this story is passive. Now, I talked earlier about how the mirrored shortages of time. Our speaker has been wounded. He might be short on time. Our lovely young lady ended up being short on time. I don't think that's probably how this developed. I think probably, and I'm only conjecturing here, but I'm conjecturing here because this is so bad that I have to justify it to myself in some way. It is terrible that we are getting this as filtered through another character. We should not be in this weird house with this weird fella and his Pedro. We shouldn't be there with them. We should be with the painter and his wife. This should be their story. We should be learning their nuances. We should be taking into account those things, those little things in their relationship instead of the relationship between our speaker and his Pedro. Because it seems that Poe had started writing this story in that way. Maybe he refused to revise it to make it a first person account of the painter and his wife. Maybe I don't know. But I think that probably it became pretty obvious that there's no sense of urgency in this story. There's nothing to move you along. And because there isn't, because the story is so dreadfully boring as filtered through another story, as filtered through another speaker, pardon me, he had to add an element of dread for our speaker. So, okay, well, I guess our speaker here is also wounded very badly. And if he's wounded as well, we're starting the story off with a sense of dread, and we start the story with a sense of dread, and we end the story with the horror equivalent of a punchline. But it doesn't have to be our speaker who dies, because if it's our speaker who dies, how are we getting the story? I hope that makes sense, because I think it's a bad way to write a story. We should have this told to us from the painter, but then we wouldn't get to give this little uh, judgment on the painter about how evil he is. And then the final thing I want to talk about here from a writing perspective, we have, where is it? When he first finds the painting, the portrait of the lovely young lady, I glanced at the painting hurriedly, and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent even to my own perception. But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. That's terrible writing. That's terrible writing. Look, I closed my eyes. I did not know why. Then I thought about why I closed my eyes. And I figured out it was to give myself time. You're filtering your very emotions. You're filtering your very subconscious actions. You don't get to filter your subconscious actions. You saw the picture and clamped your eyes shut. In the darkness, you searched for why, and then you found it. That's all you have to do. You don't have to say, I was confused as to why I closed my eyes, but upon further inspection, I understood. And I believe that why I understood was because I had contemplated the very countenance of the way this woman looks, right? Like, that's bad writing. Anyway, that is all I have for this video. This will be in the short story playlist here on the channel, but it will also be in the Edgar Allan Poe playlist, as this is part of October 2023. So check out those playlists if you are interested in something like that, and I hope to have you back for the next one.